Good afternoon, class. It's Sir Capistano again, and welcome back to Math 1 Statistics. Wherein for today, we will actually continue on our discussion in regression analysis. During the last meeting, we have already defined correlation in regression analysis, wherein by correlation, it is actually uh, as a statistical method used to determine whether there are or there is a relationship between paired variables. And by regression analysis, we use this statistical method to describe the nature of relationship between variables, wherein we actually computed for the regression line or the equation of the regression line, wherein we actually extrapolated values from a given correlation or a given paired pairing of variables. Or if you want to know natin, we actually discussed or introduced scatter diagram. We we performed computation using the Pearson product moment, wherein we have here the interpretations of correlation coefficient and their strength of relationships. We also illustrated the different appearance of relations wherein we have the perfect positive, perfect negative correlation, zero correlation, and nonlinear correlation. We had this example wherein we look into fruit shake store that who gets random data from 12 days for 12 days and he get the temperature and the sales during the summer season. So we had here this scatter plot and we performed the computations. Remind ko lang yung sa error natin dito last time, this should be 183,222 rather than 88,733. Okay? Then we perform linear regression. Then we have this relevant equation for linear regression wherein we actually compute the equation of the line or the best fit line where we get the slope and the y-intercept. Right? So last time we get this equation of best fit line and we ended up with making sense of that linear regression and a quiz. Hopefully, you're done with this quiz. The submission fee for this quiz is already available on our Edmodo class. Okay, so let me just check everything else. All right. So for today, we will be actually continuing on the test of significance. A test of significance for coefficient of correlation may be used to find out if the computed version are occurred have occurred in the population in which two variables are related or not. So basically, this is just the continuation of correlation coefficient. Kumbaga, nung last time, tinitingnan lang natin na doon ba sa samples na mga kinuha natin, ay meron bang direct correlation or yung tinatawag natin perfect positive correlation or negative correlation. But for test of significance, titingnan natin dito class kung yung bang nakuha mong samples, pwede ba niyang uh, pwede ba niyang i-represent yung isang buong population. And that will be using this t-distribution with n minus 2 degrees of freedom. Gagamitin natin itong tinatawag nilang t-test. Okay? Dito sa t-test na to, I will be using this formula wherein t is actually just equal to r multiplied to the square root of n minus 1 and n minus 2 over 1 minus r squared. So that n there is our number of paired samples. R is our correlation coefficient and T is the test for correlation coefficient. So we will be actually following this procedure or steps in how we can go into that t-testing. So kung makikita nyo class, ito actually ay magpo-fall na dun sa tinatawag nating hypothesis testing. Wherein, kung baga, given your observed data, given your, kung ano man yung nakuha yung data mula rin sa inyong measurement, halimbawa dun sa paired variables natin, magagamit ba natin yung mga nakuha nating datang yun para sa pag-represent o pagde-describe ng population. So by dun sa example natin kanina, kung ang ginawa lang niya ay halimbawa, 12 days lang yung kinuha niya during the summer season, eh kung isipin natin ang summer season ay nagla-last ng 2 months, by 2 months we have their 60 days. Yung bang 12 random samples na yun ay enough para i-represent yung buong population or yung buong span ng summer season. So yun yung sinasabi natin dito sa ating testing for significance or test of significance. Wherein we have the 6 steps. First, we just need to set up the hypothesis. By hypothesis, you know that hypothesis is just an intelligent guess or just an inference. Wherein for this type of measurement or this type of statistical method, we will be following this pattern. So we have here the null hypothesis, which is our h over 0 or h sub 0, and we have alternative hypothesis, which is h1. So for null hypothesis, ang ibig lang sabihin niyang rho is equal to 0 ay sinasabi lang natin na there is no sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a relationship between variables. And by variables, yung paired variables natin yun. And for our alternative hypothesis, there is no sufficient evidence. Ay, baliktad. Dapat ito. There is sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a linear relationship between the variables. So, ganyan natin isa-set up yung ating hypothesis. So, for the significance level, usually, ito ay related dun sa ginawa natin last time, sa error, sa pagkuha natin ng number of samples, kung naalala niyo yun, sa Slovenes. Kung ano yung set nating error nung sa, ano natin, sa pagkuha pa lang ng number ng samples, usually, yun din ginagamit natin ng level of significance. Ang level of significance usually goes from a 1%, 5%, or tawag dito, hanggang 10%. Minsan may nagta-25 or may nagta-20. So, depende dun sa iti-test or dun sa level ng significance na sinasabi natin. So, ano ba yung percentages na sinabi mong yun? Yung percentages na yun, actually, yun yung kino-consider mong error nyo sa data mo. So if you say that your level of significance is 95%, ibig sabihin, 5% doon ay yung sinasabi mo may sampling error or kumbaga yung sinasabi nating error. So, kailangan natin iset yung alpha na yan. So, for the third step, we just need to calculate the degrees of freedom. By degrees of freedom, ito ay ginagamit sa t-testing wherein we just need to subtract 2 from the number of samples. Then using that degrees of freedom, we need to determine the critical value of t, which is using the critical values for students' t distribution, which I will be showing later on. Next step natin is pag-compute ng Pearson's R. Ginamit natin last time yung ating Pearson product moment correlation. And for step 5, we need to calculate the value of t using yung pinakita ko kanina and determine the statistical decision for the hypothesis. So ganito yung mangyayari. Yung nakuha nyo, kung yung t na na-compute nyo ay mas mababa kaysa ron sa nakuha nyong t critical dun sa inyong step 3, you do not reject the HO. Ibig sabihin, or H0, which means, i-conclude mo dyan na there is sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a linear relationship between the variables. And kapag naman mas mataas yung T computed mo kaysa sa T critical, you need to reject the HO. Okay? Or the H0. Meaning to say, meron kang sufficient evidence na ipakita na para ma-conclude mo na merong linear relationship between the variables. For the population yan, ha? So, yun yung sinasabi natin. So, yung conclusion natin dito ay i-conclude natin para dun sa population. So, i-try natin gawin ito. Ano? So, we will be using the same example like we did earlier. So, check muna natin. Ano ba yung sinasabi nating level of significance? For example, we have here, how will 0.05 level of significance would look like? So, ang sinasabi natin diyang level of significance class ay parang tinitreat lang din natin yan dun sa ating normal distribution curve. Wherein, yung buong curve na to, yung buong area under sa curve na yan ay 100%. Okay? So, ano yung sinasabi nating ditong 100%? Ito yung possibility or yung area kung saan natin nagsiset tayo ng tinatawag nating rejection area. So, by rejection area, sineset natin yun. Kung halimbawa, sabi natin 100% itong buong to. So, kung i-convert natin actually yung 0.05 sa percent, yan actually ay equal sa 5%. Okay. So sabi natin, with that level of significance, magsaset tayo ng 5% na yung 5% na yan ay dyan yung region kung saan natin i-reject yung ating hypothesis. So basically, pag sinabi natin 100% nito, ang mangyayari ang 0.05% of significance ay ganito mangyayari. Ito ay 0.025, meaning 2.5%, yung area na yan, and meron yan yung iyong negative part, and ay dun sa kabilang side, tapos meron ka ritong uh, 0. Another 0.025%. 0.025. Mali ako ng pwesto nung ano natin. Ang ibig sabihin yan, itong area na to would account for 2.5%, and this area will actually set for 2.5%, at itong buong unshaded area, yan yung ating 95%. Okay. So, ano ang meron dito sa level of significance na to? Yung 2.5% na to at 2.5% na to, actually, yun yung tinatawag nating rejection area. So, ano yung ire-reject natin sa area na yan? Ang ire-reject natin dyan ay yung HO, at itong part na to naman ay yung ating do not reject HO. So, anong ibig sabihin nito? Ang ibig sabihin lang nito, kung gusto nating magkaroon or makakita ng, ng difference between tawag dito, kung gusto nating makita yung evidence na i-conclude na merong sufficient para dito sa testing na to, merong sufficient evidence na para sabihin na merong linear relationship yung ating mga variables, your computation must fall within this dalawang 2.5%. Okay? So, ganun yung itsura ng ating level of significance. At para naman lumabas na na walang linear relationship yung ating mga variables, it will fall under that 95%. So, yan yung sinasabi nating level of significance. Mamaya, mas magkakaroon ng sense ito pag ipinakita natin using computation. Okay? So, punta na tayo sa ating example na ang gagamitin pa rin natin ay yung ginamit natin last time. So dito, same problem, temperature versus sales. And for this, we need to determine at 0.05 level of significance whether the correlation in the population is greater than 0. So, yun lang ang ibig sabihin natin dito. Not greater than 0. Hindi ko ito napalitan. Sorry, class. Whether the correlation, it's more on whether there is a linear relationship in the population. Yun yung kailangan natin ipakita. Okay? So, it's the same scatter plot. Hindi natin ito masyadong gagamitin dun sa computation natin kasi ang tinitest natin dito ay test of significance for the population. So, in t-testing, we need to first set up the hypothesis. So, for the hypothesis, ang kailangan lang natin gawin dito we need to have our HO and our H1. Since walang sinabing, walang sinabing or wala tayong i-consider kung one-tailed or two-tailed ba itong measurement natin, ang pwede natin gawin ngayon ay i-rewrite lang halos yung binigay na example sa atin. So, yung binigay na example sa atin kanina, pinapakita lang, ang sabi lang niya, there is a sufficient evidence to, to predict or to, sabi lang niya, there is no sufficient evidence para dun sa HO to conclude that there is a relationship between the variables. So, ang ilalagay lang natin dito, same lang, sulat lang natin yung row, 0 is equal to 0, or ang ibig sabihin yan, there is no sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a relationship, a linear relationship between between ano ito? Between temperature, shortcut ka lang ha, and sales. So yun lang yun yung ating HO dyan. So ang important na word dyan ay no. So ganun lang din yung gagawin nyo para sa inyong alternative or alternative hypothesis. Wherein ang gagawin lang natin dito, imbis na equal, gagawin lang natin siyang equal. So, ang mangyayari, same na statement, tatanggalin nyo lang yung no. So, ibig sabihin, for this one, there is sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a linear relationship between temperature or atmospheric temperature and sales. So, for the level of significance, kung makikita nyo dyan, nakalagay na yun dun sa problem, we have here 0.05. So, ibig sabihin, susulat lang natin dyan, ang alpha natin or ang level of significance is equal to 0.05. So, yun lang. Yun lang yung kailangan natin dyan sa step 2. And for step 3, maalala nyo, ang step 3 natin is we need to determine the degrees of freedom and find the critical value. So, for that one, all we need to do is just get the n. As you may see here, we have 12 days, meaning to say our n is equal to 12. So, for the degrees of freedom, it is just 12 minus 2, which is actually 10. So, yun lang yung kailangan natin para dun sa first part ng step 3. And for the next part, we need to find the critical value or the T critical value. So, paano ba natin yung gagawin? So, keep in mind na ang DF natin ay 12 minus 2, which is 10, and our level of significance is 0.05. So, saan ba natin gagamitin yon? So, in that, to find the critical value, we actually need to look into this t-test table. Dito sa t-test table na to, dito natin makukuha yung ating value or yung value ng yung ating t critical. So, kailangan nyo lang gawin, keep in mind of the DF. Ito yung DF na line or na column, as you may see here, DF. And we will be using the 0.05. So, this is two tails kasi magkabilang side yung tinukuhanan natin ng 0.25. So, para sa two tails, ito yung natin. So, we have 5 and 10. Kukunin nyo lang kung saan sila nag-meet. So, dito siya. And ito. T critical natin or T critical ay equal sa 2.228. So, saan ba natin gagamitin yung T critical na yan? Gagamitin natin yan later on sa ating conclusion. So, wherein dun sa conclusion natin, i-check natin kung mas mataas ba or mas mababa sa T critical yung makukompute natin T. Okay? So, in that, let's go into step 3. Step 4. So, again ha, para dito sa t-test table, ang kailangan yung gawin, you need to determine the degrees of freedom, that is just n minus 2. So, hanapin mo yung kung ano yung makuha mong DF dun sa left side. Then, hanapin mo yung iyong alpha dun sa taas. So, for this one, we have 0.05. And in that, we have 2.228. Okay? So, that is our degrees of freedom and critical value. Okay? And in that, let's go into step 4. So, step 4 natin ay pagka-calculate natin ng R. So, swerte tayo, last meeting, na-compute na natin yung R nito, which ang R natin dito is 0.93. And we actually determined that this R, or using this correlation coefficient, we have a high relationship between the 12-day sample of the temperature and the total sale. Very high nga yata yun eh. Very high relationship. So in that, we will be just using that R for our computation. So in here, we just need to calculate the value of t using our formula earlier, wherein our formula earlier is just t is equal to r times the square root of n minus 2 all over the square root of 1 over r squared. So, yan yung compute natin. So, yan yung ating plug in. And upon computation, we will have there 8.0. Right? And as you may see here, we have here this decision rule. And as you can see here, our T critical kanina, or yung nakuha natin sa table, is 2.228. And our T computed is 8.0. Therefore, our T computed is actually greater than our T critical. So our decision here is to reject our null hypothesis. So anong ibig sabihin nun? So, for step 6, balikan lang natin ng konti. Okay? Lumabas dito, ang T-computed natin is higher than T-critical, kaya reject hypothesis. Ano yung hypothesis natin? Null hypothesis natin. Sabi natin, ang null hypothesis natin is there is no sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a linear relationship between our between the sales and the temperature. So dahil i-reject natin ang ating since we reject HO, ang magiging conclusion natin dito ay there is sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a linear relationship between atmospheric temperature and sales. Pwede mong ilagay dyan at 0.05 level of significance. Okay, so that is how we approach t-testing. So, since na-reject natin yung HO, we have this conclusion. Okay? So, hopefully, naging clear yung step-by-step na ginawa natin kanina. So, ulitin lang natin kung ano ba yung mga pinagagawa natin kanina. So, yun nga, kailangan nating sundin yung procedure na to, set up yung hypothesis, set the level of significance, calculate DF, then determine critical value of T, calculate Pearson R, calculate the value of T, and determine the statistical decision for hypothesis testing, which is this one, and we need to state the conclusion. So, ganun yung ginawa natin kanina, wherein we set up the hypothesis, or set up a hypothesis wherein we said that rho is equal to 0 if there is no sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a linear relationship between temperature and sales. And for the alternative hypothesis, or H1, we suggested that rho is not equal to 0, which means that there is a sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a linear relationship between temperature and sale. We set the significance level. Usually, significance level is given by the problem. And for the next part, you need to determine the degrees of freedom, wherein the degrees of freedom is just n minus 2, which is 10. Then for finding the critical value, we just accounted for the alpha. So, and degrees of freedom, wherein using the t-test table, we get 10 at the DF and 0.05 on our confidence level. So in that, we got 2.228 for the T critical. Then we compute the Pearson R, and happily or fortunately, we already computed for the Pearson R, which is 0.93. Then we just get the T computed using this formula and this one. Therefore, we get zero point 0.8, and T critical is 2.228, and T computed is 8.0. And as you can see here, T computed is greater than T critical, so we reject HO. So, pakita ko lang kung anong naging itsura na nanak. So, kumbaga, dun sa ating pinakitang graph kanina or dun sa normal distribution, ang ibig lang sabihin nito, itong point na ito ay pwedeng nating iset na 2.228 or negative 2.228, and this part is positive 2.228. Okay? So sabi natin ito yung do not reject area, and itong dalawang side na to, ito yung rejection area. As you may see here, 8 is actually far beyond here, somewhere here. So, nandun siya sa rejection area. So, kaya natin siya reject. Alright? So, upon rejecting the HO, we can just conclude that since we reject HO, there is a sufficient evidence to conclude that there is a linear relationship between atmospheric pressure and sales at 0.05 level of significance. And that is how okay. So in that, I will be leaving you this assignment. I will be posting the submission bean for this assignment on Wednesday, and your assignment will be due on Friday. So, hopefully, magawa niyo to ng maayos. So, in that, we will be ending our discussion on correlation and regression analysis. A screenshot of this assignment. Thank you and have a great day. Bye bye.